We're here to talk to you today about a project we're working on, which is looking at animal conservation and how that's affected by behaviour, and especially animal culture. So I've already mentioned it's going to be about birdsong, but we're going to take a couple of steps back first, and then there'll be a bit of an activity for you to do as well, so that you can see some of the mechanisms we're talking about. So this is me. So I'm Becky. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester, and I work with Chester Zoo, which is the biggest zoo in the UK. And we're doing a lot of work there with our birds. It's very important at the moment because European zoos are very focused on songbird conservation. And the kind of research questions I look at are how behaviour impacts on conservation, which is what I'm talking to you about today, and also what's the best way to manage animals in captivity. So probably the applications for that are fairly clear. They're managing animals in zoos and also endangered species conservation.
Thank you. And I'm Tucker Gilman, so I'm a biologist at the University of Manchester. And I say I'm a biologist, but I'm a mathematical biologist. So I use mathematical models to study biological questions. And the questions I'm really interested in are, one is, how does learning evolve? So almost all animals learn, even some plants learn, but they learn very differently. And you're much better at learning than your cat is, for instance. But why? And why would it be that some animals have evolved to learn well and some haven't? And presumably everything's evolved to some ideal for its species, but why are the ideals different? And then also, I'm interested in why mate choices evolved. So why do animals choose the mates they choose? Why do male birds prefer some kinds of females and females prefer some kinds of males? And also in humans, why do we like one person and not another? So these are the kinds of questions I try to answer with mathematical models. But then when I want to work with real biology, I collaborate with people like Becky, who can do much more hands-on work with the animal systems.
So before we get on to what we actually research, I think it's quite important to look at what problem we're trying to solve. And that takes us back to the state of birds. So most people think that birds are doing pretty well. They're very common, you see them all the time. But around 1 in 8 species of birds is threatened with extinction, and a lot more of those species are declining. And they're faced by a huge range of threats. There's habitat destruction, illegal hunting, illegal pet trade, invasive species. Probably, if you can think of a threat, there's a bird species that has to deal with it right now. When I first heard that, I found it really hard to kind of visualize, so I've stolen this nice infographic from BirdLife. And you can see here, those top 3 lines are all threatened with extinction, so they're an immediate risk. And then the next 3 lines are declining and are getting pretty close. So that's quite a big proportion of birds. And this is worldwide, but concentrated in some main spaces, including Indonesia, which is where a lot of the birds we work with originally come from. So if I talk about conservation and how we can help the planet, you probably have some ideas about what those things might be. When I normally do this talk, people say things like recycling, taking your bike instead of the car, that kind of thing. And that's really great if everyone does it. The problem is that it can take a really long time to get everyone on board and for that to have an effect. And in some cases, it's too late for some species that will work. And that's when we have to do something a bit more drastic. And that's what we call a conservation intervention. And they're a really useful tool. They fall into 3 different types. So we have translocations, which is where we would move animals from one place to another place. Reintroductions, which is putting animals back into a place where they have been, or maybe haven't been, but they're not now, and we're putting them back. And then also captive breeding, which would be having animals in zoos, breeding them there, maybe to reintroduce in the future. Now, historically, these ideas weren't used for conservation, and they were normally used because, although I hate to say it, the British liked hunting quite a lot. And it gives us some really weird situations. There are now more endangered banteng in Australia than there are where they're from in Indonesia. And that's because the British in Australia decided they wanted something to hunt. Indonesia's a long way away. They didn't want to go there to do it. So they brought all of the animals to them. And in around the 70s or 80s, a couple of really high-profile examples for conservation worked really well. And then people decided that this was a great idea and it's how we should be doing conservation. Now, the success of these is really variable. Some of them it works quite well. Some animals just don't respond to it at all. So along the bottom here, I've got a few birds, which are some of my favourites. This is the kakapo from New Zealand, the hihi, which is also from New Zealand on the far side. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about the California condor in the middle. So in around the 90s, there were only a few of these birds left in the wild. So the San Diego Zoo decided they were going to take them all into captivity and breed them there instead. They did really well. They had a really intensive breeding program, and the numbers went up and up and up. And they've released them back into the wild. The population's doing well. They use the older birds to teach the younger birds. But it could still be improved. The threats that face the California condor haven't gone away, and that's because those threats are people. So they come into contact with farmers who don't like them, maybe shoot them. They eat carcasses that have been poisoned with lead. They fly into power lines. So they've not learnt to behave in a way that they avoid threats. And so that would be something that would be really useful for them to do. So really, what I've just talked about is how behaviour can influence these translocations, reintroductions, captive breeding. And it's something that we really need to consider, and it hasn't really been considered until quite recently. Behaviour is really important for species persistence. It's for predator avoidance, how to find food, how to socialise with other animals. And sometimes animals just can't do this if they've been raised in captivity or moved. It's becoming much more commonplace to train animals now before we release them, and that's after a few of the early reintroductions failed because animals couldn't recognise predators. But there's something we don't really consider still, and that's animal culture. When I say culture, most people think of art, dance, poetry, that kind of thing. But the definition of culture is just a learned behaviour that is different between different populations of the same species. So we can see that in animals as well. And I think the example that most people are familiar with is termite fishing in chimpanzees. Have you seen where at the mounds, they put the sticks in, get the bugs out? But the way that different populations do that is actually very variable. Some of them construct the tools in different ways. They can strip the bark off, they can just snap the twigs off. And some of them use the same behaviour, but for ants' nests. So it's the same behaviour, but it's done very differently in different populations, and those differences are passed on. So this is where we get on to birdsong. And this is a really good example of an animal culture. It's passed on from father to son, and it's actually really variable within species. And what we can see are different vocal dialect regions appearing. And that's where different populations of the same bird species sing very differently. So maybe birds from over there sing very differently to birds that come from over there. There's lots of ways that this can happen. They fall into two main categories. One is selection-based, and that's to do with maybe the birds are in a different habitat, maybe they eat different food, maybe they look a little bit different, and the others are related to learning. So before we go on much further, I'm going to tell you how we would actually measure this, how we look at birdsong. So this is kind of my day-to-day. This is me at the zoo, and I can use two different techniques. One on this side is an automatic recorder, which I just screw up into a tree and leave to go for days on end. And that records all of the sound in an area, which I can then go through and pick out all the different species of birds that are singing. The other side is something kind of like what I'm wearing right now. So it's a handheld recording device and a microphone, which if you want to record an individual bird is something that you have to use. This one picks up everything. This one's much more localized to a single bird. And that's useful if we want to see how birds differ individually in their singing. Now, when we're looking at dialects, we can do something like this. So I take those recordings, I load them up into some software called Raven, and I can measure lots and lots of different things about them. So what frequencies birds sing at, how high or low, how fast they sing, how many different notes, or for birds those would be like words that they sing. And we can plot all of those onto a graph like this. Now this one, sadly, is not from my research because I've not got this far yet, but it's from Australian ring-necked parakeets. And you can see here, the spots and the triangles show two different populations, and this is how their song maps in space, which is pretty cool, so they're really separate. The other side, the white dots down the middle, show hybrid birds between the two populations. So a hybrid sings kind of a middle song, which you might expect. So what species do we choose to work with? That's another big question. There are lots of bird species, and lots of them are really endangered. Now, unfortunately, not all birds are suitable for this kind of research. For very endangered birds, it's often very difficult to access them. Maybe they live very deep in the jungle. There's often quite a lot of politics that surround this kind of thing. People are very protective of their very endangered birds. And also, they've got a really small population size. So it's very difficult to make one of those graphs like I showed you if you only have 2 individuals from each place. So what we've done instead is used a model species. And a model species is a species which has a system like the species we want to help, but that is really available and that we can understand very well. And then we can apply what we find to other situations. And the bird I work with is this one, the Java sparrow. And that's partly why we're here in Japan. So this bird was domesticated here. And there are lots of people here doing some really good work on their songs. So I've been up at the University of Hokkaido at the moment, working there on the Java sparrow song. Now, we're going to take a little pause there, and we're going to do an activity. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that I'm going to play the first person in your group a bird song, okay? You can hear it a maximum of 3 times, and then you're going to have to, I think in your groups, get in a line on either side of the classroom in your order, and then you're going to pass the bird song that you hear on to the next person. They're going to pass it on to the next person, and then when we get to the end, we're going to hear what that song sounds like. Are you ready?
Okay, how high can you go?
Okay, you want to hear it again?
5, 6, 7.
Okay, so do you want to go back and stand with your group, and I'll tell you when to go? Okay. Okay. So if you are not the person that's listening to the song, try your best not to listen. Maybe cover your ears, because otherwise this won't work. So are you ready? Each person can hear it 3 times. Okay? So go. No? Why does it do that? No, I don't want you to do that. I don't know why my computer does that so often. Starts playing random videos. Okay, so what did your song sound like? Like that?
Yeah.
Okay, what did your song sound like? Okay, so other than the first people who know what herd they song, so you can't answer this, I'm now going to play you 4 different songs, and I want you to tell me which one you think you learned, okay? So the first one, I don't know how loud this is going to be. Okay, song 1, song 2, song 3, and song and song 4. So Person one, you can't say anything. What does everyone else think they learned?
Hands for 1, 2, 3. Do you want to do like hands for 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yeah, so who thinks that they were learning song 1? You guys? Who thinks they were learning song 2? Who thinks they were learning song 3? And who thinks they were learning song 4? Okay, so you guys were right. Everyone was learning song number 1. So both of your groups started with exactly the same thing, and you both ended up with something completely different at the end. So that's the end of the activity, and you can all sit down again now, which you're probably quite pleased about. So this tells us something really interesting about how birdsong can evolve. And what you've just demonstrated really very well there is something called cultural drift. Now, you might have heard of genetic drift before? No? So there's something analogous in genetics, which is that you get random accumulation of mutations in your DNA, so the string of A's, G's, T's, and C's, that can be used to tell different populations apart. It's completely random, doesn't necessarily mean anything, and the same thing can happen in birdsong. So random changes occur during the learning process. The next generation might leave out syllables, they might make up new ones, they might add ones in. I think there was a lot of leaving out in this case. And then that's passed on, and you can see that we can end up with things that sound very different in quite a short period of time. So that's a pretty cool thing about birdsong, but why is it important and why do we care about it? So song plays a really important role in mate choice. Females can use it to choose between different males. And one thing that's quite common is that females prefer songs from their own population compared to others. So if you were a female over there, you'd have preferred that song to the song from over there. And that could be just due to familiarity, you like what you hear the most, or it could be adaptive. So if you hear a song from where you live, it probably means that male is quite well adapted to where you live, so your children will be as well. And this can cause a real problem, because when we do conservation, one of our key aims is to maximize genetic diversity. So we would quite often take birds from lots of different populations and put them all together. Now you can see there where the problem might arise. If we're getting all of these birds that all sing differently and we're putting them all together, they might not want to mate with each other because they don't like the songs. And actually this has been seen to happen. So there's a bird called the kakako from New Zealand, and people do lots of translocations with that bird. They take the birds from all over and put them together. And what they found is that the birds only mate with birds from their own population. So although we've tried to keep genetic diversity really high, that actually makes it worse. We also get the same thing between wild and captive individuals. And our best example there comes from mice. So within 3 generations, you can get around 90% assortative mating. So within 3 generations, that's like great-grandfather to grandson, is all the time it takes before those differences have built up that much. So I'm just going to focus a little bit more on zoos and captivity, and because there's a bit of an extra complication there, and that's that animals adapt to being captive. So obviously a zoo is very different to the wild. There's no predators, there's always food, and there's loads and loads of people. So differences in behaviour are quite well documented. So things like temperament, how calm or angry an animal is, and how fearful they are of humans can differ very quickly. And we generally see that animals in captivity are calmer and less scared of humans than those in the wild. One thing that we don't often study is how cultural traits like song adapt to captivity. So there is one example that I know about, and that's the Bengalese finch, which is another piece of research that was done here in Japan. And this is a very special case because this is actually domestication. So these birds have been bred to be pets rather than just to be in a zoo. So this is likely to be a bit more extreme than what we'd see in a zoo, but it's still very interesting. And what we find is that Bengalese finch songs are much more complicated in captivity than the wild version of Bengalese finch song, which is sung by white-rumped munia. And there are a couple of reasons why this could be. Perhaps the simplest one to understand is that there's no predators in a zoo or in captivity. So you can sing as loud and as long as you want, and you don't have to worry about someone hearing you and eating you, which is obviously a bit of a problem if you're in the wild. So you can afford to have a really long, complicated song. The other thing is artificial selection, whether or not we're meaning to do it or not. If you choose birds that are really good breeders or really good parents, that requires quite a lot of brain power, and it requires birds to be quite smart. So birds that are good parents might have bigger brains than birds that aren't. And if you have a bigger, more well-developed brain, you have more resources to put towards singing. So you can have a really complicated song just because you're a bit smarter and you've got a few more resources to dedicate to that. So we're not really sure what the mechanism is, but we do see these differences building up, and that could be really important for conservation. So coming on to what we're actually studying, this is a very new project, so if any of you have any ideas, questions, comments, I'm going to open the floor up in a second. But what we really want to see is, do Java sparrows show these dialects that I've spoken about? And do they influence mate choice? Do females prefer one over the other? If they don't, that's probably great, but if they do, that could have a real impact on conservation, and we'd really like to think of a way that we can mitigate that if possible. So just going to throw out my acknowledgements there. So I work at Chester Zoo in Manchester. Tucker works at Manchester. We're funded by the National Environmental Research Council, and we're visiting Japan thanks to a grant from the Daiwa Foundation, and we're being hosted by Hokkaido University. So just going to stop there, and does anyone have any questions? You've got, yeah.
Actually, I'm surprised by how picky birds are. Some species are actually known because of evolutionary reason to actually, if they can't find mate of their own species, they will actually try to mate with individuals of other species because the wiring of the brain basically make them accomplish that action, which you think would be, it's at the worst case now it's a bit of a waste of energy and material, but on the long run it's probably helpful to have that sort of behavior to maintain the population. Now, why would birds be so specific? What are the evolutionary pressures that actually can overpower the general spread of the birds through less selection?
Okay, so it's kind of to do with why our dialects are forming. And actually, one of the big reasons that they do form is to do with species recognition, which is why if a female doesn't hear a dialect that she likes, she might assume that that's because all of those birds are a different species. So if there's another species that has a better song, then sometimes that can happen. So there's a very good example from cardinals, and they live in sympatry, which is just together, with another species called duicas. And those have really exciting, complicated songs compared to what cardinals sound like. But other than that, they're not that different. And so where females come into contact with these really exciting birds, they would breed with them instead, which seems to be kind of maladaptive. But I guess the thinking behind it is that their sons might end up with more complicated songs, which if the females are mating with birds that aren't even their own species that have more complicated songs, would be very evolutionary advantageous. And it's just one of those weird quirks of birds, I guess. They can be very picky, or they can be so picky that it's actually detrimental to them, which is quite often what we see in conservation.
Right, yeah, because I mean, when we talk about evolution, we always talk about the peacock and that stupidly long tail that is otherwise very disadvantageous for survival.
Yeah.
So you see something very specific in birds, in that, I mean, the courtship and all this is so complex. Is this really specific to birds, that level of sophistication?
Well, there's a lot of African cichlids. So there's some fish that actually have very complicated mating rituals and very elaborate mating colors, but we don't see them as much because they're in lakes in Africa. So scientists have studied them a lot, but it's not something that people see every day. So there are, I'm trying to think of other systems that have very elaborate courtship. Whales, yeah. I guess with whales, it's often not just individuals, but the whole family gets involved in this, right? The mother is involved in helping her sons court the females. So interesting aside, just because I thought about it while Becky was talking about this. Another project that my lab is doing is really similar to this because humans do this too. Humans have different preferences based on accent, and we know that people from some places prefer accents from other places, but we don't know why. And so it's kind of a similar interesting thing to think about why are people doing the same thing as these birds.
Do the bird songs cause any conflict between species?
So they can do, and that's another reason. We quite often see that birds that live with close relatives have very different songs to those relatives when they're separate. So they might sound very similar when they're separate, but they sound really different when they're together. And that's because of this kind of mating conflict between the two species. Birdsong is also very commonly used in territory defense within a species. So lots of birds have very complicated songs because it shows how great they are, and that means they can defend their territory really well. And you can also get patterns of song matching in birds, which is where two neighbors try and outdo each other by matching songs but making them a little bit better. And so that can really cause quite quick evolution in our songs.
If you look at it at the molecular level, in terms of the speed at which those traits evolve, in terms of epigenetics especially?
So it hasn't been studied very much, but recently, about 3 years ago now, they've fully sequenced the genome of a British bird called the great tit, which is very well studied for a lot of reasons. It's a really intelligent bird. I don't know if it's probably not as famous here because it's a British story, but these are the birds that learned when they used to deliver milk door to door that they could peel the lids off the milk and eat the cream off of the top of the milk, which is part of why they don't deliver milk door to door, because the birds were eating it. So they're really intelligent birds. And recently they've been able to look at the genome of this bird and find which genes have been evolving really quickly. And some of the genes that have been evolving most quickly in the time that the birds have been in contact with humans have been genes that are involved in intelligence and genes that are involved in song. We don't know why yet, but this pattern is there. So those genes do seem to be evolving very, very quickly.
Could you, I don't know what the practicality of this, but could you study the communications of living things that are close to birds in order to kind of better understand bird songs?
Yeah. Do you want me to take this one? So maybe not necessarily close to birds, evolutionary-wise, because birds are kind of their own thing, and the only other thing would be reptiles, which don't really make an awful lot of noise. But this kind of research does go on in lots of other species, so we've got lots of different systems to compare. People do a lot of work with things like whales and dolphins, because they have very complicated communication, and also with different kinds of primates. So Tucker mentioned humans, but all kinds of primates use vocalizations to communicate. So we're getting quite a good idea of how lots of different systems are communicating with vocal signals, and then we can compare between them to see how those systems differ.
So to follow up on it, the idea is actually really interesting. People are doing it not the way you suggested, but the opposite way right now, because the most closely related thing to birds, even more closely than current reptiles, are dinosaurs. The birds are, so a lot of people now will say sort of glibly at meetings that birds are dinosaurs because they're descended from them. So people now are using what we know about birds to try to understand the way that dinosaurs communicated. So we're finding out now, if you've seen a picture of any really recent pictures of dinosaurs, most of them have feathers on them. And we're trying to use what we know about birds to understand how dinosaurs may have used what we can guess about their vocal system for communicating. Thanks very much for listening to us today.
And actually, before we go, I was very impressed with how well you guys all did with our activity. So we've actually brought some prizes with us. So which team was right? You guys were right, weren't you? So I think you should probably get first choice. But I was really impressed with everyone, so everyone can have something from our really giant box of things. I'm not going to give them the whole pack.
Okay, so while I'm here, I'm going to make a quick pitch for the University of Manchester, which is where we come from. Actually, let me ask before I start, did you guys know before you heard we were coming here that there was a University of Manchester? Had you all heard of it? You had? Okay. The reason I ask is because I don't know if you can tell from my accent, I'm not British, I'm an American. And when I actually applied for the job here, I didn't know there was one. Because it's not, well, I did when I was applying, but I didn't know until I saw it. Because it's not well known in the US. But it's actually one of the biggest universities in Europe, and one of the top 40 research universities in the world. So they do a lot of really cutting edge research in physics and mathematics and in biology. So it's a global top university. And a fun town as well. Manchester is, I think everybody knows about the soccer, but it's also a good town it's got a nice mix of old areas and new areas for a European city, and a good sort of a vibrant cultural scene in music and such. But the thing about Manchester that I really want to pitch to you is there's two things that I think make the University of Manchester a really good place if you're considering going to school outside of Japan. There's some fantastic schools here, but if you're thinking about going to school abroad, it might be worth considering Manchester if you're interested in sciences, and for two reasons. One of them is that we have really good field courses. So those are courses where you would go to a field site and study actually in a research setting. We have courses in Africa, in South America, in different parts of Europe, and so it's really a good opportunity to go someplace and study the kinds of systems that you're interested in those systems. But the other thing we have that I think makes Manchester really, really special is what we call our research placement program. So if you go to Manchester to study environmental sciences or life sciences, then after your second year, you're able to go on a program where we will help you find a position in one of the best research labs in the world that's doing the kind of science you're most interested in. So in your in this third year, after your second year, you would spend a year doing full-time research. So you don't take tests, you don't take classes, you don't study from a textbook. Instead, you do research, working with the scientists who are doing the cutting-edge research in the field, and you do everything that a scientist would do. You plan experiments, you conduct them, you write them up and report them. Sometimes you can publish the papers or report them at international science meetings, which means that when you get out of your undergrad education, you can say, when people coming from classroom backgrounds can say, okay, I've learned all the skills I need to become a scientist, and you can say, I am a scientist. Look, I spent a year doing it. Here's the paper I wrote. Here's the recommendation I got from someone in your field who you know and respect. And I think it can put people from that program ahead of people who are coming out of pure classroom-based things. I think that's something Manchester can do that not a lot of universities can do. So I think it's a really exciting program. And if it's something you might be interested in, feel free to email me about it, because you can tell it's something I'm pretty excited about. And if you have questions about it, I'd love to tell you more about it.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel for more IB Science videos.